So I think we will start up officially. It's top of the hour, and I want to welcome all of you to this wonderful full spectrum anger effectiveness system training. This is a free webinar that is really close to my heart for reasons that I'll get into in a few minutes, because this is material that is so important, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Let's just say it that way for now, and I'll explain that in a little while. And the giants whose shoulders I'm standing on are people who are amazing academicians, clinicians, and researchers, and none of them were entrepreneurs. And what they ended up developing, as you'll hear in a little while, was an absolutely marvelous framework for working with anger that very few people know about. And today that starts to change in a big way. So what I want to do is switch over now that you've seen my face for a moment. I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint that's going to be guiding us through this webinar. And it should be showing right now. Yes, good. And good. And hi, Robert. I'm glad you're stoked about the webinar. Good. So let's get rolling now. And the way I want to start is by letting you know an informed consent piece, which is probably obvious to almost all of you, but I just want it to be explicit, which is that this is a webinar and therefore it's just strictly educational. I am a psychologist, as many of you know, but I'm not doing psychotherapy in a webinar. And attending this webinar, which is educational, means that you agree that how you understand and utilize what you learn during this webinar is solely in your hands. So I'm going to give you a framework for what we're going to be covering today. And the presentation will be a little over an hour long, and then we'll have time to get through as many of the questions as we might have time to do at that point. So there are 4 shades of anger. 1 is helpful, but it's rarely called anger. 3 are harmful, but they're far too common. And anger management helps with only 1 of these 4 shades of anger. Even most psychotherapists don't know what you are about to learn in this webinar, which is what I have come to call full spectrum anger effectiveness. And what we're going to be covering is a piece on helping you identify which of 4 different anger styles is yours. You may have more than one, as I do, but which of the 4 main anger styles do you most resonate with? What the anger effectiveness breakthrough is, and that goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, and we'll say more about in a little while, about the shoulders that this work stands on. Why you haven't heard about this before, which I touched on briefly before, and I'll say more about also in a little while. The 4 shades of anger, which is really what the heart of this webinar is about, and how you can upgrade your anger literacy into full spectrum anger effectiveness. So if you have questions, there should be a question and answer section on your screen. If there isn't questions and answers on your screen, then you can go ahead and post them in the chat box. I will answer questions to the extent that I have time to during the question and answer segment after I've finished the presentation, but feel free to add your questions in at any point, and I'll look those over when it's the right time. So how do you do anger? Well, I'm going to start with the fact that with these 4 anger styles that I'm about to describe, as I see it, we really are in the midst of an anger epidemic, and no one escapes dealing with anger for better or for worse. So what we're going to look at first is, what are your anger styles, and what are the anger styles of people in your personal and work life? And I'm going to be the guinea pig for this. When I was 16, I made a very conscious decision, a decision I put in words. And it was a decision that I made because there were two versions of anger that I grew up with in my immediate family. My dad's version of anger was raging. He was a rageaholic. My mom's version of anger was depression and kind of cabinet door slamming and things like that. So dad was very overt and very harming in obvious ways, very shaming and raging. And mom was generally withdrawn and sullen when it came to anger. Well, by the time I was in my mid-teens, those were the two versions of anger that I had been exposed to the most. And as far as I knew at that point in my life, that's what anger was. So I was actually saying out loud by 16 or 15 or somewhere in there, maybe even a little bit younger, I don't do anger. And so you see on the left here is me about, I don't know, about three-ish, 2, 3, something like that. And in the middle is my high school photograph. And then on the right side is me in the years after Woodstock. And that's another story for another time for those of you who haven't heard my story about having been sent to Woodstock, actually by my parents. It's a great story, but I'll have to save that for another event. But the point being was that as a teenager, I had decided I didn't do anger because the two versions of anger I was exposed to, which is all that I knew about anger, I wanted nothing to do with those. And if that's what anger was, then I don't do it. And so what I did was that I repressed my anger. Since I didn't do it, I tried to bury my anger alive. And one of the main forms that my buried anger took when I was an adult, a younger adult, thank goodness not so much anymore, in fact, not at all for a long time, actually, since I first encountered this material that I'm going over with you today, I became what I call a black belt sulker. So I would sulk. I would do anger in the form of trying to make people feel badly for me or guilty or things along those lines. And what I'm going to invite you to think about is repressors, expressors, imploders, and exploders. You know, there are different flavors, different anger styles. And repressors believe it's inappropriate to express their anger directly. And that was certainly part of how I came into adulthood, was with that attitude. Expressors feel that they must vent their anger. Imploders direct their anger toward themselves, and exploders direct their anger toward others. So these tactics combine to create the 4 anger styles that I'm about to go through with you. And as I go through these 4 anger styles that are based on these 4 traits of repression, expression, imploding, and exploding, I'm going to invite you to think about what were your family's favorites, or are your family's favorites, and what are your current favorite styles with anger. So the first style is the repressor imploder. So you can see repressors and expressors across the top here, and you can see imploders and exploders down the left side. And we're going to be going through all 4 of these currently empty boxes in this chart. So the first box here is repressor imploder. So repressor says, I don't do anger, I can't be angry, and imploders direct anger at themselves. So these are the folks who are very much like how my mom was. They did what's called conversion reactions. In other words, they convert their anger into a different form. And examples of conversion reactions, and this is not by any means a complete list, but it covers the high points. Examples of conversion reactions include depression, which is not to say that all depression is anger turned inward, because sometimes depression is biological, physiological, biochemical, et cetera, but there are forms of anger that are actually depression. They show up initially as depression, but they're anger in disguise. Another example of a common conversion reaction is hiding anger behind grief or tears. And a third is physical symptoms that can include chronic pain, headaches, and a whole wide range of other physical symptoms. But I'm featuring chronic pain because I'll be coming back to that when I explain to you how this material emerged in the first place. Now, what about expressor imploders? Expressors believe that venting my anger is being authentic. And if I'm an expressor imploder, I'm being authentic in venting my anger toward myself. And the technical psychological term for that is retroflexion. In other words, instead of expressing anger outward, I turn it back on me. And the technical psychological term for that, as I said, is retroflexion. And examples of retroflexion that I imagine all of us can relate to, I certainly know I can and do, are an inner critic. So we all have an inner critic. I imagine all of you are aware of what an inner critic is. And the retroflexion in inner critic is where we do shame attacks on ourselves, guilt attacks on others. There's a lot of self-hate involved. I am seeing, by the way, a comment about blurry, and I'm not able to do anything about that from my end. Most likely the blurriness is because you're watching on a Wi-Fi connection. And so I see your question there, Robert, and no, you may want to close down some of your other programs because you may be taxing your bandwidth on your Wi-Fi. That is most likely why the PowerPoint is blurry. If others of you are seeing, if any of you is seeing a clear PowerPoint, if you can just make that comment to confirm that for me. That's usually a bandwidth problem on the receiving end. Good. So the next aspect, the next style of anger are the repressor exploders. So I don't do anger, I can't be angry, but I still explode. I still direct the anger toward others. Thanks, Darlene and Nancy and Paul for saying that the screen is not blurry. Robert, it's a bandwidth issue with your Wi-Fi. So hopefully you can, thanks Lillian, you can hopefully shut some things down so that you free up some bandwidth. And then you might want to just refresh your screen. So repressors, I don't do anger, I can't be angry, and they direct this toward others. And the form that that takes is passive aggressiveness. My mom was somebody that was really good at that, and I learned how to do that as well. And the common forms of passive aggressive anger include but aren't limited to, in fact, none of these, like I said earlier, are limited to these examples, but these are the main examples of these different styles of anger. For repressor exploders, the passive aggressiveness commonly takes the form of covert manipulation, laying guilt trips on people. I'll just sit here in the dark. I don't mean anything. It's fine, whatever you want. Stonewalling, which means that there's just this wall that's put up and you're not getting to my heart. Niceness in quotes, so not authentic niceness here. That's why it's in quotes, because niceness in quotes is really about covert contempt. It's about being contemptuous, feeling contemptuous, but putting on a mask, a fake mask, a persona of niceness. So again, that's why niceness is in quotes. It's not the real thing. It's the pretense of niceness when it's passive aggressive repressor exploder anger. and secret grievances and resentment. So I'll carry grievances and resentment and I'll explode them. I'll vent about it maybe on other people, but not the person that I'm carrying it toward, at least not directly. And bitterness. And then there are the expressor exploders, like my dad. Venting my anger as being authentic, and that should not say directed at self here. That's a typo. That should say directed at others. There we go. And the this particular anger style I refer to, and many of us who do this kind of work with anger refer to as vomiting for obvious reasons. And vomiting anger, what happened to a slide there? Looks like a slide is missing, which I apologize for. But examples of vomiting anger are shaming. Oh, I know where it is. I know where it is. It's coming up. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to open up the first of our polls, and then I'm going to go over the examples of vomiting anger. So I'm going to load up a poll that you're going to see on your screen now. And it says, what's your primary anger style? Repressor imploder, expressor imploder, repressor exploder, or expressor imploder? And go ahead and just fill out the poll, and let's see what the percentages are among those of you who are on the call. This is all anonymous. Nobody's going to know who has said what. This is anonymous polling. So far, everyone who has answered the poll is a repressor exploder. Let me do expressor imploders now that you can see this complete box here. The vomiting, outer criticism and contempt, overt blame and manipulation, hatred, verbal explosions and raging, which was my father's form, and physical violence are the most common versions of vomiting. So I see you all coming in with your polling, and I see right now that 50% of you are repressor imploders, 43% are repressor imploders, 14% are expressor imploders, 14% as well are repressor exploders, and now we actually have a tie of 38% and 38%. On repressor imploder and repressor exploder. So yes, Robert, you can be more than two. There are a number of us who are switch hitters. I have done a real good job in my history of being a repressor imploder. I've done my share of depression in the past. I've had a vicious inner critic, expressor imploder. I've done my version of niceness and stonewalling and guilt tripping, well, not more directed toward myself than others, but secret grievances and resentment. And I've never been really big into the vomiting part because it was just so toxic for me growing up that I just didn't let myself express that particular aspect of or style of anger. Not that it wasn't within me. It was capable of being expressed. It just wasn't. So yes, you can be more than two. You can be a switch hitter or a multiple switch hitter. So I'm going to move forward now. I'm just going to let you know how we're looking at the on the poll at this point, which is of those of you on the call, 38% of you are expressor imploders. So you express the anger, but you direct it toward yourself. 31% of you are repressor imploders. Now it just changed to 36% expressor imploder and 29% repressor imploder. So the imploders really are winning on this particular call. Directing anger toward self amounts to about 65% of those of you on the call. 14% of you are repressor exploders and 21% of you are expressor exploders. And of course, as I was saying before, a lot of us are multiple styles. We're switch hitters. And what I'm going to invite you to do, no matter what your primary anger style and secondary anger styles are, is to hold compassion toward yourself, because every single one of us came by our particular anger style honestly, for good reasons, and not only in the context of our own upbringing in our families and our communities and our schools and our houses of worship, but also in the broader society, which really doesn't have a very good relationship with anger, as I imagine all of us on this call are quite aware of. So I'm going to move on now to the next section, which is how I outgrew my anger style, which I've already described to you, where I did a fairly good job of 3 out of the 4 anger styles in terms of how they showed up, and I just wasn't willing to do express or implode in any kind of overt way. So what doesn't resolve anger? Anger management does not complete anger. Controlling anger, which is about managing anger, keeps anger alive. And catharsis alone, venting, discharging the anger, actually has been shown by research to make anger worse. Now, there is a flaw in my judgment in that research, in that the research that very, very dramatically demonstrated that catharsis or venting makes anger worse did no differentiation between or among the 4 flavors or shades of anger that we haven't gotten to yet. And if it had, I think that some of that information would have been a little bit different from the blanket statements that research made. But as a general rule, catharsis by itself does tend to make anger worse, and you'll understand why when we get into that section later. Catharsis really is the whoever screams the loudest or pounds the hardest wins approach. And you see on the slide, it says not. They don't win. Whoever screams the loudest or pounds the hardest gets temporary relief, usually at expense toward others and at expense toward oneself, only because I vent it off today, but it comes back again tomorrow. So nothing long-term has been accomplished. Now, these are the shoulders that this material is standing on. As I said earlier, this material, the anger effectiveness system, is standing on the shoulders of giants. The origins go back about 30 years now. More, maybe even 40 years. I think about 40 years now. About 40 years ago, a 20-year study began. And it began because the teaching hospital at the University of Arizona, their pain clinic, started to notice that they were having a recurring problem with a certain percentage of their pain patients. And that segment of their pain patients were people who had chronic pain that the medical team would have sworn on a stack of Bibles should have responded to the medical treatment that they had prescribed or done for that person, whether it was surgery or medication or whatever it might have been, that pain should have been handled. So we're not talking about people who have pain that conventional medicine kind of shakes its head at and scratches its head at and says, well, we can try this, we can try that, we're going to do trial and error. That exists too, but this is not the dilemma that the University of Arizona Teaching Hospital Pain Clinic had. They were having a dilemma with the patients of theirs, the particular patients of theirs, who they would have sworn should have responded to the medical treatment that they were convinced should work on that particular patient, but it didn't. So finally, they had one of these, what I call V8 moments. They slapped their forehead and said, I could have had a V8. In this case, I could have had a psychologist. They said, you know, maybe we should contact the University of Arizona Psychology Department and see if they can help us with this particular segment of patients that we don't know what to do for. And so they did. They contacted the psych department. A wonderful, brilliant psychologist was chairman of the psychology department at that time by the name of Roger Daldrup. So they contact Roger. They say, Dr. Daldrup, here's our problem, which I just explained to you. So they explained the problem to him. And they said to Roger, what can you do about it? Can you do anything for us? And Roger, being a good clinician and researcher, said, I don't know. Let's find out. And so they threw out all preconceptions about what anger is and isn't and how to treat anger, and they allowed the patients that were the problem that the pain clinic had identified. They let those particular patients teach them what was really going on over a 20+ year study. And out of that came an approach to psychotherapy that's called focused expressive psychotherapy. There's a large number of research journal articles that appeared on focused expressive psychotherapy over that 20+ year period. And the things I'm about to share with you grow out of what they discovered about these particular patients, which is that almost to a person, the patients who didn't respond to the medical treatment that the pain clinic team was certain they should, those particular patients should have been responsive to, all had repressed anger. Anger that wasn't responsive to anger management, anger that wasn't responsive to catharsis alone. So they had to develop some other approach to dealing with that. And after they had been doing this for 20+ years, they started to train and certify psychotherapists outside of the University of Arizona system. And I was among those in the 1990s who was blessed to be trained and certified by Roger Daldrip just before he retired. There were levels of certification, and I was level 3 certified, which is where you're certified not only to work with the public on these approaches, but to actually train and certify therapists in these approaches. And since being trained in the first half of the 1990s, I've done well over 1,000 what I call anger completion workouts, which is a particular strategy that is based on what they developed at the University of Arizona for not managing anger, but completing the repressed anger that was causing the chronic pain to not be responded to by those particular patients that the pain clinic was worried about. So Roger Daldrip and his team, Larry Butler and Dave Engel and Leslie Greenberg, these folks wrote a textbook based on what they discovered about anger called Focused Expressive Psychotherapy, Freeing the Over-Controlled Patient. And Roger Daldrip, with a professional writer named Jody Gust, also wrote a book for the general public back then called Freedom from Anger. And Roger's definition of unhealthy anger is life energy not available for living. And he has long since retired. As far as I know, the entire team has long since retired. And as far as I know, I'm one of the only psychologists still alive or still working with people. In my case, I work primarily with leaders and businesses these days, and I train therapists rather than doing psychotherapy myself anymore because of how extensive my out-of-town schedule is. And it breaks my heart. Bottom line is, I cannot allow this wisdom to die. I mentioned earlier, the people who developed this were brilliant clinicians, academicians, researchers. Not a one of them was an entrepreneur. And virtually no psychologists who are trained and certified to train and certify other therapists in these approaches are still available to do that, except for me. There may be somebody else out there that I haven't talked to in years that might still be doing it, but I might be the only one left, and I cannot let this die. So part of why this is a free webinar is because I wouldn't feel right letting such brilliance disappear from this planet, especially because the usual anger treatment as usual is primarily anger management these days, and catharsis to a secondary extent, and there's a better way. So pure anger is simply an emotion. Emotions are information, and it's what we do with that information that can be helpful or harmful. And I see a comment about this reminds me of what a colleague and friend of mine as well, Lillian, and a colleague of yours says in his book on illuminating the negative, which is ignoring what's negative doesn't make any sense. You've got to illuminate the positive and the negative to be truly empowered. And you're spot on there, Lillian. And so, of course, is David Corbin. So this webinar is about how to do that in a good way. Authentic, empowered, helpful anger signals when we are out of integrity with ourselves and gives us energy to take helpful action. So authentic, empowered, helpful anger tells us there's something that I'm not doing or saying that needs to be done or said. So I'm out of integrity with myself, but I've got energy to take action in a helpful way if my anger is authentic and empowered. And I'll go into in a little while what that looks like. Distorted, disempowered, harmful anger sabotages our authenticity, effectiveness, health, collaboration, love, and integrity. Anger effectiveness, on the other hand, enables you to master authentic, empowered, helpful anger, shift distorted anger into authentic anger, complete recurring anger instead of managing it, and repairing damage from distorted and recurring anger. And that's where we're heading. So here's the big picture of the framework, and then we're going to go into each of these elements one at a time. This is my Conquering Anger Mountain diagram, which is a full spectrum anger effectiveness system that includes boundaries, escalation, flooding, anger purgatory, completion, anger completion, repair, and a new plan. And down here where I'm circling, I think you can see my mouse maybe vaguely, I'm circling the lodge. And that's just a metaphor for how we feel if we're at a ski slope or not skiing necessarily, but we're at a beautiful mountain lodge in the winter and we're in front of the fireplace with friends and cheer and happiness and everything's cozy. And when we leave the lodge, we travel up Anger Mountain on one side, and if we make it all the way up to the top of this side of Anger Mountain, we end up having to come down the long way. So that's the diagram. You'll see it again in a little while. But where we're going to do a deeper dive is into these 4 shades of anger that are the heart of Anger Mountain: boundaries, escalation, flooding, and recycling. Now, boundaries is self-disclosure without justifying. It is the simplest, purest form of anger that never gets called anger in most circles. And it is simply what pure anger is nothing more than no and or ouch. No and or ouch. And we'll go into, like I say, we're going to do a deeper dive into each of these in a moment. This is still giving you the big picture. Escalation is inner critic contaminated self-disclosure. So self-disclosure with justification. And this is, escalation is agitation when you don't honor a boundary, when you don't honor simple, pure anger. Flooding is about reaching what I call the Popeye point. If you remember Popeye the Sailor Man cartoons or the movie, the famous line when Popeye has had it with all the bullying that's going on in the cartoons, he says, "That's all I can stand, I can't stand no more." So I refer to that as the Popeye point, and that's flooding. Incapable of connecting at that point. You're flying blind when you and what this happens. People flood when they disregard their escalation. Flooding refers to a huge physiological process that I'm going to describe when we get to the flooding section. Recycling anger is the 4th shade of anger. Yes, Lillian, your no and ouch were a big aha for me. Love that boundaries clarification of the breach which causes anger. Absolutely. So the recycling shade of anger is being an attacking, self-righteous victim. And this is recurring, looping anger. It loops and circles around on itself over and over again. That comes from being right about how wrong another person is. and not just being right about how wrong another person is, but being right about how that other person or situation must change before I can be okay again. And we're going to go into that in great detail as well. Frankie, will these slides be available after the webinar? These are really great. Well, yes, they'll be available. And a lot of us know that one, Robert. A lot of us know it. It's a very common form of anger in our culture. And I'm going to illuminate that when we do the deeper dive in that section. Yes, Frankie, the slides will be available afterwards because you'll all be able to access the replay of this webinar. So you'll be able to see the slides on the replay. Why each shade of anger must be dealt with differently? Well, boundaries prevent escalation, looping, I'm sorry, looping is beyond flooding. Escalation, flooding, and looping or recycling anger. So boundaries prevent the other three forms of anger from needing to appear. Escalation calls for U-turns back to boundaries. Flooding makes escalation U-turns temporarily impossible to do for reasons I'll describe when we get to that section in depth, and requires a timeout instead. And looping requires completing old unresolved anger that keeps being involuntarily reactivated in the present. So you stop being triggerable into that kind of looping anger when you're in future similar situations that otherwise would have reactivated you. So keep this in mind as we go through the rest of this material. As you're already clear about, I'm really talking here about the psychological dimensions of anger. But physiological issues like chronic pain, biochemical imbalances, chemical toxicity, sleep deprivation, nutritional deficits, and so forth, all influence a person's susceptibility to anger. These kinds of issues physiologically can leave us in a physiologically irritated state. I'm not talking about emotionally, it translates into emotions. I'm talking about our physiology is on a sensations level irritated. And when we are physiologically irritated, we're more prone to acting on or expressing in unhelpful ways the anger that we were carrying in the first place. And so those issues, those physiological issues, can magnify anger issues that were already there in the first place. I'm not going to be addressing physiological issues in this particular webinar other than to acknowledge to you and ask you to keep in mind that these physiological dimensions can influence the extent to which someone expresses unhelpful anger. And I will give one example to prepare for a story I'll tell you a little bit later about my dad, which is that I didn't discover that my rageaholic dad, I didn't discover until I was in my 20s that he was in chronic physical pain. I kind of knew that, but I didn't put two and two together. It wasn't until I was in my 20s when I put together that his chronic physical pain and the steroids that he was taking to try to manage that pain combined to make him extra susceptible to raging. What did the physiological irritation from the chronic pain that he carried combined with the side effects of steroid use, which can be rage, can include rage sometimes, what predisposed him to going in that direction because of those physiological challenges that he had and the medication challenges he had because of those physiological issues? He was physically abused repeatedly by his father growing up. So he had unresolved anger, and his physiological condition magnified his susceptibility to being overtaken by that. Keep that in mind for when I return to talking about Dad later on. So boundaries effectiveness. Now we're going to go into a deep dive in each of these areas. So boundaries profile. What boundaries has to do with anger is, again, pure anger is simply no and or ouch, with a low emotional charge around them. It's the purest form of anger. Boundaries, in a more general sense, are about what fits and doesn't fit for me, or what does or doesn't fit for you. And there are two basic categories of boundaries. Yes and yum. This fits, this feels good, this is a yes. And no or ouch, which is this doesn't fit for me, this hurts, this isn't yummy at all. And again, the no and ouch side of boundaries is pure anger. Anger doesn't get any purer than a simple low emotional charge no or ouch. Ironically, this purest form of anger that exists is rarely referred to as anger, which is really tragic. Now, here's what a boundary is not, because there's a lot of boundary bashing that goes on out there. My boundary is that you, and then you fill in the blank. It's just a fancy you statement that's not a boundary at all. I'll give you a definition of boundaries in a moment, but let me say first what a boundary is not. A boundary is not a line drawn in the sand. Don't cross this line or else. It's not a position or a posture, posturing, you know, puffing out the chest, I dare you. It's not a philosophy. It's not an ideology. It is not an ultimatum or any other form of manipulation or control. And it is not highly emotionally charged or judgmental. In fact, all of those features, lines drawn in the sand, positioning, posturing, philosophizing, being ideologically right, and ultimatums, manipulation, control, high emotional charge, and judgmentalism, all of those are symptoms of escalation or worse, not of boundaries. And you're about to see why. But first, an authentic boundaries definition. Isn't this the basis of this setting a new conditioned response instead of automatically reacting? Yeah, it is. It's the foundation for doing that. That's exactly right. I'm glad that you're saying, Helen, that this is for you great clarity about boundaries. So here's my definition of an authentic boundary. Any limit I need to honor in order to love or work with you without resentment and with integrity. Any limit I need to honor in order to love or work with you without resentment and with integrity. So let me say this in another way about what isn't a boundary, even though people who use the word boundary often call these things boundaries. If a boundary includes shame, blame, or grievance editorials, negative editorials about why I'm right to have a grievance and why that grievance has to be resolved by other people or situations before I can be okay, if a boundary can only be honored if another person behaves in a particular way, or if a situation changes to meet my expectations, then it's not a boundary. It's actually one of the other three shades of anger that we're about to get into: escalation, flooding, or looping. I'm glad you're seeing the value of this explanation of boundaries, Frankie and Lillian and Helen. So let's open up the next poll. I'm going to end the first poll. And let's see if I can get this next poll reactivated. All right. So the second poll is now loaded. How good are most people at expressing their boundaries? How good do you think most people are? So if you can see the polls, the poll having popped up again on your screen, you can click not so good, fairly good, very good. How good are most people at helpfully expressing their boundaries, at expressing their boundaries in good, helpful, collaboration promoting, authentic, low emotional charge kinds of ways? What do you think? Not so good, fairly good, very good? Oh, it would help if I started the poll, wouldn't it? So the poll is now open, and go ahead and vote. And I'm going to move forward as you all vote. So far, 100% of you are saying not so good. Let's see if any of you votes for fairly good or very good at healthy boundaries. Okay. Still holding at 100% not so good. Escalation effectiveness is our next area. How about a lot less than not so good? Stefan is saying, yeah, point taken, point taken. 4 sources of the shade of anger that's called escalation. And what escalation is a boundary with agitation, increasing amounts of agitation attached to it. So there are basically 4 sources of escalation. We escalate when we don't recognize a boundary that we have. We escalate when we don't know how to honor a boundary that we have in an empowered and helpful way. We escalate when we hope we can get away with ignoring a boundary. Like, it's not that important. Maybe I don't have to say it. Maybe I don't have to do something about it. Maybe somebody else will figure it out for me and handle it anyway. And we escalate when we believe our inner critic's spin or editorial about the boundary, about our boundary. And it's always a shaming, blaming editorial if it's the inner critic's storyline that's in charge. Can you retroactively set and express your boundaries? Absolutely, you can do it retroactively, Robert. And we will get to that when we do the section later on repair and new plan. So I'm going to come back to that question in that section. But the answer for now is yes. Now, key escalation symptoms, here are what I call the 3 Ds of unrecognized or ignored boundaries: disdain, disconnection, and depletion. Disdain is spiraling toward fight. So when we get to flooding, you'll see that there are basically 4 reactions that are available to us when our limbic system in our brain takes over our thinking brain. And that's fight, flight, freeze, and faint. And I'll get into all 4 of those when we get into flooding. But disdain is spiraling toward flight, growing increasingly resentful and angry toward others. Disconnection is spiraling toward flee or freeze, run away or be the deer in the headlights. And that's feeling increasingly shut down, more walled off from the other person and or out of touch with yourself. And depletion is spiraling toward fainting. And fainting isn't necessarily literal, although sometimes it is, but more commonly it's feeling increasingly exhausted and or toxified, feeling depleted. Point being that if you are noticing that you're getting agitated and you're noticing that disdain is growing in you, disconnection is growing in you, and or depletion is growing in you, you are in the shade of anger called escalation. Addition escalation symptoms, and if you notice this in others, same thing. Boundaries distorted by agitation, annoyance, frustration, distress, resentment, or shutting down. The voice becomes higher, more pinched, or just flat, monotone. Muscles start tightening, or the face becomes more and more blank. Attitude becomes increasingly critical, judgmental, insistent, and controlling. Emotions, anxiety and fear start taking over. Guilt and shame start taking over. Yes, Helen, seems to you that fibromyalgia and multiple sclerosis might be symptomatic of anger repressed? There is some indication that anger, unresolved anger, has a place in resolving those conditions, which are, of course, connected to chronic pain. But again, don't forget that there's a physiological, psychological interplay. But you see, with all of these escalation symptoms, if we're in escalation with these symptoms, if we haven't gone over the line into flooding that you're going to learn about in a moment, we are still capable of doing what I call de-escalation U-turns, U-turns to de-escalate back into boundaries. This is where anger management approaches really can help, because we are getting more and more agitated, but we're still capable of thinking things through. We're capable of saying to ourselves, you know, I'm not liking how I'm feeling. And the most important thing, which I almost never see in anger management training, is people trained to ask themselves a very simple question when they're escalating. What's the boundary that I have that I either didn't know about, didn't know how to express or honor in a good way, or hoped I could get away with not honoring? That's the key. That is the key to doing effective escalation U-turns. So I'm going to open up the next poll. How good are most people at helpfully expressing their boundaries from the last poll? 100% of you said not so good, or or less, or worse than that. So I'm going to activate the next poll, which is about escalation U-turns. And I've just now escalated it. I've just now activated it. How effective do you think most people are at doing effective escalation U-turns, at recognizing when they're escalating and using the escalation simply as a wake-up call that says, oh, I could have had a boundary. I wonder what it was. Okay? And so the U-turn back into boundaries. So where would resentment be in these anger descriptions? What I want you to think about is that anger falls on a continuum, and it's all anger, from slightly agitated resentment to blooming and budding and growing anger to rage. And whether we're talking about resentment, anger, or rage, it's all part of a continuum of emotional intensity. And some people won't allow themselves to experience the full force of their anger. They learned rules that said you can't, it's not, you don't do anger. Like I learned those rules. So I would not very often give myself the luxury of feeling angry or rageful, even internally, let alone, I'm not acting on it even, but I wouldn't give myself the opportunity to feel that inside myself. The most I could do when I was still in my I don't do anger phase was a little resentment would leak out once in a while. It's just anger in a mild form or a repressed form. So those of you who have completed the poll are saying, 57% of you are saying, not so much, not effective so much at doing good escalation U-turns back to boundaries. And 43% of you are saying, well, somewhat effective. Great, good. So we're going to move on to flooding effectiveness. And what flooding is what I call a limbic system takeover. So the limbic system in our brain is the emotional part of our brain. It's the reptilian brain. It's the part of our brain that's all about fight, flight, freeze, and faint. It's not the thinking part of our brain. It's a much more primitive part of our brain. Primitive meaning developmentally earlier. It comes from our anatomical heritage. And what flooding is, as a shade of anger, is where stress chemicals like adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol, quite literally flood our body and go straight up to our brain, flood our brain to such an extent that those chemicals, when those chemicals flood our brain, they actually shut off our cortex, the thinking part of our brain, and they activate our reptile brain, the limbic system, into fight, flight, freeze, or faint reactivity. That's the Popeye point. When a person has escalated to the point where their brain is bathing in stress chemicals, they cannot think their way out of a paper bag. None of us can when we're flooded. We have to wait 15 to 20 minutes at least for those stress chemicals to get reabsorbed back into our gut, back into our, out of our brain, so that our cortex, our thinking part of our brain, comes back online again and we can start thinking again. But when these stress chemicals have taken our brain over, there is no anger management. There is no escalation U-turn possible. All there is a timeout. Robert, you were asking if I see a gender split with the last poll. I don't see individuals. They're composite percentages, and they're not broken down by gender, so I don't know the answer to that. Where does festering anger fit? Festering anger we haven't gotten to, Liv. We're going to get to that in the next shade of anger after flooding, which is hidden anger disguised in. Hidden anger can be disguised anywhere depending on a person's anger style. So if we're a repressor, and whether we do it internally or externally, if we're an anger repressor, then hidden anger fits in to all of these shades of anger. Well, the 3 shades of anger that are not helpful: escalation, flooding, or looping anger. And when going back to flooding, that's why you see why it's called flooding, is that our brain is flooded with stress chemicals. When we are flooded, we say and do things that we later feel regretful, embarrassed, guilty, or ashamed of or about, but only after we've recovered from being flooded. And like I said before, it takes about 20 minutes or more for bodies to reabsorb these stress chemicals to the point where our thinking brain comes back online. So I said I would say a little bit about the 4 F's. And to me, flooding is the real F word. That's the real F word. The 4 F's of the F word, of flooding, include fight, flight, freeze, and faint. Fight, number 1, is saying or doing damaging things. Flee is I'm out of here, you SOB. Freeze is being hyper alert but paralyzed, like the deer in the headlights. And faint is the energy draining out of us, like a possum reaction, just playing dead, really. So those are the key flooding symptoms. Let's see. Let me go back to some of these comments here. What about polite refusal to escalate a situation? Well, that's wonderful. It's great to do a polite refusal to escalate a situation as long as we know what yes is. There's an old saying from parenting. If you're going to tell a child no, which has to be done a fair amount of the time, you have to also tell them what yes is. Otherwise, if you leave it to them to figure out what yes is, then they're probably going to figure it out wrong. So polite refusal to escalate a situation is wonderful as long as one has enough boundaries intelligence to facilitate the conversation and the other person into a useful discussion around healthy boundaries. It's so obvious as a parent when you see a child loses their self-control, then as a parent you need to help them cool down, literally. I learned that from my grandmother. Yes, that's right, Lillian. Good. So yeah, that's funny. The real F word is flooding. I know, right? So the poll on escalation U-turns, 53%, 41%, and 6%. 53% say most people are effective at doing escalation U-turns. 41% say they're somewhat effective, and I'm sorry, I said that backwards. 53% say they're not so effective at doing escalation U-turns. 41% are saying somewhat effective, and 6% say quite effective. Okay, let me reset on the poll, and we'll get to our next poll, which is on flooded anger. I'm going to load that up now and start it up. And how often does flooded anger do damage? Well, not often, sometimes, or frequently. And one of you already voted frequently. Or at least maybe more than one of you. But as soon as I opened the poll, somebody was already at the helm ready to click a button. So that's great. So far, 100% of you are saying that flooding anger, flooded anger, frequently does damage, and I absolutely agree with you. Let's move on to looping effectiveness as the rest of you complete that poll. Anger purgatory is what I refer to as recycling or looping anger. Looping is a self-righteous condemnation that develops when someone doesn't do what I want them to, no matter what I try or how long I wait. Looping is anger that's used to avoid facing that I'm angry at someone who is not going to do something I want, or at a situation that isn't going to change in the way that I want it to change. Stefan says, by definition, flooding does damage. Well, by definition, flooding doesn't do damage unless we don't take a time out. But if I'm flooded and I at least have enough awareness to know that the next word that comes out of my mouth is going to be poison, I'm taking a time out, then it doesn't necessarily have to do damage. And we'll get into doing damage control or damage repair later on. Yeah, it's a lot of people just don't know how to handle flooding in a good way. And those words, by the way, are the words that I have used when I have flooded. The words were, the next thing that comes out of my mouth is going to be poison because I'm flooded right now. So I am taking a time out in order to get back in my right mind so we can continue this conversation in a good way. And yes, even if it's flooding at yourself, absolutely. If you are receiving flooded anger toward you and you recognize it and just let it pass through you and you don't resist it, then it can't hurt you. Absolutely. When we recognize escalation, flooding, and looping anger for what they are, we become much more immune to being toxified or incapacitated by them. We still may not like them, but they can't harm us as easily anymore, whether in ourselves or from others. So I want you to be aware of looping variations. There are variations on this victim stance, waiting for Godot, if you remember that play, Waiting for Godot, waiting for the person we're angry at to listen to or hear me, or to hear the truth, or to see the light, to realize what they've done to me or to someone else, or to apologize for what they did to me or someone else, or to take responsibility for what they've done to me or to someone else, or to keep an agreement that they're not going to keep, or to change, to stop doing something that they're not going to stop doing, or to feel bad or guilty for what they've done to us or to someone else, or to suffer miserably for what they've done to us or other people. Vengeance, desire to punish, masquerading as social justice. See, there's social justice on the one side, on the one hand. And yes, looping anger is a major source of disease and illness like cancers. It's looping anger. It's this form of anger that the University of Arizona Psych Department found that the patients who were chronic pain patients who weren't responsive to the pain treatments that the medical team would have sworn those particular individuals should have responded well to, they had this kind of anger. They may have been taking it out, usually with chronic pain, they're taking it out on themselves, and then periodically they're taking it out on others. My dad regularly took it out on others. These are variations on looping. And what I wanted to say about social justice is one thing. And social justice is, in my judgment, a very important thing to speak up for and to facilitate. At the same time, when an individual insists that I will not let myself become whole and complete again until social justice occurs, I have made myself a self-righteous victim because my well-being in that mindset is in the hands of external circumstances. And that is a blustery form of self-victimization. A lot of people who are locked in looping don't really realize that they can become whole and complete and still stand up for social justice. In fact, ironically, pursue social justice even more effectively. So the imprisonment of anger purgatory is looping anger is a form of being imprisoned. We instantly go from 0 to 60 or 0 to light speed, instantly, seemingly involuntarily. We go straight through escalation and flooding right into anger purgatory. We insist that another must see the light or change in some way before we can be free of our anger, before we can be restored internally to being whole and complete and authentic. And the problem is that those we want to change, that we're looping about, are exactly the people who are least likely to see the light or make the changes we want. Because the people who do, who are teachable, who are willing to be self-responsible, who do make the changes that we want, we never bother looping toward them. We don't get there with those individuals or around those situations. Looping only happens around people who are least likely to see the light or make the changes we want. So as long as we live in this state of anger purgatory, we remain victims of our own rightness addiction, reactivity, and victimization. 2 keys to anger completion, which is about getting free from this kind of stuck, looping, recycling, anger purgatory kind of anger. The first is to face the truth that looping anger means that the person we're angry at is still in charge of us, still in charge of our wholeness and completeness. And the second is release ourselves from waiting for them, which is really how I most enjoy defining forgiveness. There are a lot of great definitions of forgiveness out there, and I love a number of them that I've heard. I'm going to add another one to the forgiveness, the range of forgiveness definitions. This one specifically having to do with looping anger. Forgiveness in this context is demonstrating in the here and now that I am no longer harmed by the unacceptable that occurred in the past, or even the unacceptable that's continuing to occur in the present. So yes, these variations, all of these flavors of anger, these shades of anger, each make great tapping targets for if you're using EFT or any kind of energy psychology method. Absolutely, Helen. The requirement that the other needs to change is a veil of illusion and a lie we tell ourselves. Absolutely. When we hold on to anger, we victimize ourselves. That's powerful. Yes. And when we don't know that, we just remain prisoners in looping anger. Once we start to realize that, then we start to move toward the possibility of anger completion, which is coming up next. But first, our next poll. Before I post it, let me give you the results of the last poll. How often does flooded anger do damage? 0% of you said not often, 17% of you said sometimes, and 83% of you said frequently. So I'm going to close that poll, and I'm going to reset so that we can open up the looping anger poll. And I think what I'm going to do with this poll, I should have done this all along, but I forgot to. I'm going to make the results visible to you at the end of the poll, the percentages. How common is looping anger in our society? Rare, somewhat common, or quite common? How common is this shade of anger, this looping, recycling, blustery victim anger common? How common is it in our society? Oh, there's a nice typo too. Our society. Let's see. Demonstrating is the significant word here in this definition. Absolutely. Eleanor Roosevelt said that holding on to unforgiveness was like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. That is one of my favorite definitions of non-forgiveness as well. Absolutely agree. So let's move on now to repair and new plan effectiveness. So when we complete the anger, and what opens up the door to being able to complete our looping anger is simply those 2 things: recognizing that we're looping, recognizing that we're looping around someone or something that if they were going to change, they would have changed by now, and becoming willing to restore our wholeness and completeness despite the other person or situation not changing the way that we are hoping to. On the freeway during peak time, looping anger is rampant. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Repair and new plan effectiveness. So what to do after flooding recovery or looping anger completion? Here's the bottom line. Once we have recovered from flooding, remember, we're not usually needing to do big repair when we're in escalating anger, because we can still do U-turns back into boundaries. But where we have to do anger repair is oftentimes with flooding anger and always with looping anger. And apologies, when we're doing this kind of repair, damage control afterwards, apologies are BS unless they are accompanied by repair, which is about fixing the damage that's been done to whatever extent is actually feasible to do that. And sometimes that's not at all, and sometimes it's a little bit. And a plan for how you'll handle future similar situations in a realistically next step better kind of way than you did this time around, along with the commitment to getting whatever support you're going to end up needing in order to succeed with following through on that plan. So never, ever, ever, ever accept "I'm sorry" as the end of a conversation. I'm sorry is cool as the beginning of a conversation, but I'm sorry without repair and a new plan is garbage, nonsense, and meaningless. Do you have a category between somewhat and quite common? Well, I could invent one, but I didn't create one. So I'm going to give you a looping repair example next, but first I'm going to end this this poll on how common looping anger is in our society. 0% of you said it's rare, 27% of you said it's somewhat common, 73% of you said it is quite common. So I'm going to end that poll. And I'm going to load the next poll after I tell you this story. This is a photograph of my dad when he was alive and in his, let's see, I'm trying to remember what event that was. I think he was in his 50s at this point, in his late 50s, maybe hovering around 60. I don't exactly remember. But you remember that yeah, breaking patterns versus empty words. That's exactly right, Frankie. I said that Dad was a rageaholic, and when Dad raged, he would blow up. He would only do this behind closed doors, by the way. He was an upstanding pillar of society, did a lot of authentic, really wonderful good in the world. And in fact, you know, I want you to see me while I tell you this story. So I'm going to switch back over to me while I tell you this, because it's a very personal story. And so Dad, when he would get angry, when he would do his raging, was always only behind closed doors. He was very charismatic out in public. And almost never did people see the side of him that my mother and my brother and I saw. When he would rage at one of us, he would then completely stop talking to us. And he would continue to not talk to us, rarely for days, usually for weeks, and not terribly uncommonly for months at a time. When I was growing up under my parents' roof, the longest Dad went not talking to me after he raged at me was 6 months. My younger brother, the longest he went not talking to him after raging at him once, on one occasion, was more like 9 months. And whenever it was that he would start talking again, it would be with an unspoken expectation that we're never going to talk about it again. We're going to breathe a sigh of relief, and we're just going to keep moving from there. So there was never any "I'm sorry," never any repair, never a new plan to handle things a step better next time around. Well, as a child, when my dad would rage, I would run away with my tail between my legs. As I moved into my teens, I started shifting from that posture into increasingly the opposite posture, which was getting in his face and going eye to eye and toe to toe with him so we could mutually escalate, which is part of why I ultimately decided I didn't do anger, because that really didn't take me anywhere useful either, except I felt good about finally being able to stand up to him, and that had some value in terms of what we call in psychology separation and individuation, becoming my own person from my parent. Sounds like a champion stonewaller. Yes, yes. So one of you has a brother who has stonewalled you for 5 years. And yeah, stonewalling is one of the forms that this can take. And yes, it was painful. It was very painful. When I got into adulthood, I had in my mind that well, let me just say it this way. By the time I became an adult, I hated my father's guts. And worse than that, I had no hope that I would ever stop hating him. Thank goodness, through a combination of really good therapy that I started going through in my late teens, early 20s, combined with my teachability, my willingness to heal, by the time I was 28 years old, I had finally had a miracle. I had reconnected with love, authentic, heartfelt love toward my father. I grew up on the East Coast. My parents lived on the East Coast. At the time I was 28, I was already out here in San Diego, where I live and have lived since 1975. And I was back east visiting my parents. And when I arrived home, I took one look at my dad, and I was very concerned, and not just concerned for him, but selfishly concerned too, because what I saw was his skin color was yellowish. It was a yellowish skin color. A number of you are saying that it sounds like your dad, and this. So immediately, where I went to was, oh my God, I hope Dad isn't getting jaundiced with this yellowish skin color. And I knew that my father hated physicians, hated going to physicians, refused to go to physicians. But the selfish part was, I'm saying to myself, oh great, here I have finally found authentic love for my father, and now there may be something wrong with his liver, and he's going to die on me maybe. So that was the selfish part of it. But I was concerned authentically for him as well. I knew if I sat down with him and said something about this, that he was going to blow up. So I picked a setting that was a public setting where I knew he wouldn't blow up. When I said this, said to him what I'm about to say to you, that this is what I said to him in this public setting. Dad, I want to let you know that I'm concerned about you. And then all I did was, yeah, that's right, yellowish skin color sounds like a kidney or liver problem. What did I say? I meant to say liver. I did mean to say liver. Maybe I said something different. So, because I was thinking jaundice, right? And so I say to him, I have a concern about you. I'm worried about you. And then I did no interpretations, no editorials. I just observed to him the visual things that I was seeing, like the yellowishness of his skin. So just description. And I said to him, I know you hate going to doctors. I'm going to ask you if you would be willing to consider doing me a personal favor. Would you be willing to see a physician just to rule out that there's something significantly wrong? Because I'm afraid, and I'm hoping you'd be willing to alleviate my fear. So I'm very, very satisfied and happy with how I have expressed my concerns to him. Very lovingly, very non-judgmentally, and as a request for a personal favor with an expression of authentic love toward him. Well, Dad did a blow up, and it was a silent blow up. It was an under his breath blow up because it was a public setting, and completely stopped talking to me. A few days later, he was still not talking to me. We were in the car driving. We, meaning I was driving, my dad was in the front seat next to me, my mother and my brother were in the back seat. And when the other part of Dad's pattern was that if he did get angry at you, if he did rage at you and stopped talking, if you didn't apologize to him within whatever period of time he thought was appropriate, he would pick the fight up again and reactivate the fight and get angry all over again before finally doing a long-term silent treatment. So this is what Dad did in the car. So I'm driving, he's sitting next to me, and he says to me, "How dare you play doctor?" Those were his words, his first words. And of course, he was trying to hook me into fighting with him, which is what I had been doing previously to having this healing of love for Dad. And it didn't work, and I didn't get hooked. And I said to him, "Well, Dad, you know, I'm obviously not a physician. I'm a psychologist. And as a psychologist, I've had training, some training in the body, and what has gone along with that is enough training to know what I don't know about the body. But Dad, I am a doctor," because I had my PhD in psychology at that point. Well, so that didn't work. So then his next parry, his next attempt to hook me was, and pardon the vulgarity here, but I'm giving this to you word for word the way it happened so that it's real. He says to me, "You're a bullshitter." And again, he didn't hook me. There was nothing triggerable in me that was looping still that could land in me. And so I said to him an honest truth, what I said to him was, "Dad, you know, you're right. I have been a bullshitter, and I've been working on it, and I think that I still have my moments of being a bullshitter. But Dad, this is not one of them." Now steam is starting to come out of his ears because he is unable to get me hooked into the war of rage. And so his final attempt to hook me was, he starts telling me about research on livers. Now, my dad had more IQ points than I. And I was shocked sitting there listening to him because something was happening that I had almost never heard come out of his mouth. Everything he was saying about research on livers was wrong. And this is when I started to lose it just a little bit, not too badly, just started getting a little bit escalated. And I said to him, "Dad, you know, I'm just in this moment realizing that I come by my bullshitting honestly. I got it from you. Now, Dad's hands are literally coming out toward me to strangle me, except he remembers that I'm driving, so that's not going to be a really good idea." And he lapses into this absolutely furious silence. And that was the moment I had a miracle, because I still wasn't hooked. And the miracle was that I heard something inside me because I had completed my anger with him. I was no longer looping with him, expecting him to be different in order for me to be okay. And what I heard inside me for the first time in my life at age 28 was something I immediately said out loud to him. And this is what I said to him: "Dad, I am just in this moment for the very first time realizing that I don't know how to love you in ways that feel like love to you. And I've never known how to love you in ways that feel like love to you. Will you teach me how to love you in ways that feel like love to you?" And it was authentic and heartfelt from me in that moment. And it was an in the moment spontaneous aha. It really was a miracle shift. And my dad's furious silence melts away into a deeply thoughtful silence, and tears come to the eyes of this World War II veteran who was not a crier. And this was a holy silence. This was a sacred silence he had lapsed into. And that was a silence that I would not ever interfere with. I just kept him company for however long he needed to be in that that sacred silence. And after a number of minutes, still with tears in his eyes, he says to me 3 sentences that touch me deeply to this day, that I will never forget. I'd like to do that. I don't know how, but I'm willing to try. And in that moment, there was a healing. Not only the healing I came into that interaction having experienced in myself, but a healing between us and a healing that extended beyond us, because this event occurred 6 years before Dad died. Dad died in 1988. This incident occurred in 1982. And that incident was the very last time that Dad ever raged for the rest of his life. Now that is an unexpected bonus. That is I'm so sorry, Frankie, that your system froze, but you should be able to get the re-listen on the video. Yes, I just allowed him to express himself, but I didn't let him engage my energy in entangling a fight. Absolutely. I never count on these unexpected bonuses. I healed first. I completed my looping anger toward my father, and in this particular miraculous situation, my healing was a healing he was able to take on board. And even though the chronic pain he suffered from that kept getting worse and worse and worse until the day he died at the age of 69, even though that chronic pain kept getting worse and worse, for the first time in the final 6 years of his life, that chronic pain never resulted in a rage attack again. Irritation? Sure. It was physiological. Did he heal his childhood abuse from his father? No. But he never raged toward my mother, my brother, or me again. That's the power of repairing looping. So I'm going to load next poll, and the poll is: how often do people say I'm sorry with an accompanying repair and a new plan? Which is why I told you the story, because this is really a story about my apologizing to him for a boundary that I didn't even know I had, a boundary around what yes would be, around not knowing how to love him in ways that felt like love to him, and invited him into a plan with me, a new plan around him teaching me how to do that with him. And by the way, he did, for the rest of his life, try to teach me how to do that. And when he would start to escalate a little bit, I would say to him, Dad, wait a minute, just hold on a second. We're starting to go haywire here. I must not be loving you right. Help me know how to love you right now. And he would immediately do escalation U-turns, de-escalation U-turns. So that said, let me start this poll. How often do people say I'm sorry with an accompanying repair and a new plan? Rarely done, sometimes done, but not particularly well, or most of the time and done masterfully. So go ahead and fill out that slide. What I want to do with our remaining time is I want to go over your next step, and then I've been able to answer, I think, most of your questions that you've done spontaneously. I'm probably going to stay on after I wrap up the presentation and answer the questions that were asked when people registered for the webinar. So you're welcome to stay on after I finish my wrap up if you want to listen to those questions and answers. And if you don't have time to do that right now, you'll get a link to the recording afterwards, so you can go ahead and listen afterwards. Again, I want to do this reminder that I did at the beginning. This webinar is strictly educational, and by attending it, you did agree that how you understand and utilize what you've learned is solely in your hands. What we've covered here is this diagram in very brief overview: boundaries, escalation, flooding, anger purgatory, completing anger purgatory, looping anger, repair, and a new plan. And what full spectrum anger effectiveness is your ability to recognize and embody healthy, empowered anger, which is boundaries, true, authentic boundaries, not what usually gets called boundaries, and to recognize and take responsibility when you're in distorted, disempowered, harmful anger, escalation, flooding, or anger purgatory, the looping anger, and bring yourself back to authentic, empowered anger with attendant repair and new plan as necessary. The reason each of these 4 shades of anger requires different effectiveness skills is that boundaries prevent the other 3 forms of anger from needing to appear. So it's not about anger management. It's a whole different skill set, boundaries intelligence. Escalation calls for de-escalation U-turns back to boundaries. Flooding makes escalation U-turns temporarily impossible and requires a timeout, a temporary timeout instead. And looping requires completing old unresolved anger, like what I described in my example with Dad, that keeps being involuntarily reactivated in the present so that you stop being triggerable in the first place. So the 4 shades of anger: boundaries, self-disclosure without justifying. Boundaries effectiveness upgrades are important. Escalation, agitated, negative perspective, negative editorials, inner critic infected. Escalation U-turn effectiveness upgrades are called for, with flooding being blinded by reptilian limbic brain takeover. Timeout effectiveness upgrades are called for, and with stuck looping recycling anger, anger purgatory, anger completion, and anger repair effectiveness upgrades are called for. So how often do people say I'm sorry with an accompanying repair and new plan? 15% of you say that's rarely done. 85% of you say, well, it's done sometimes, but not done particularly well. And 0% of you said, most of the time it's done and done masterfully. So I'm going to end that poll. And I'm going to reopen the final poll. I'm going to load it up now, which is: how valuable would it be to have full spectrum anger effectiveness? Not particularly useful, somewhat useful, or highly useful. And the reason I'm asking this question is because I'm very well aware that for some of you, this overview is all you needed. And if that's true, I'm delighted, because as I said at the beginning, I cannot let this brilliance that grows on and stands on the shoulders of what they did at the University of Arizona over that 20+ year period, I can't let it die. I want this out and available to the public. But if this was something that was a starting place but not an ending place for you, I do have a 9-hour training program that I'm going to be doing online, the Full Spectrum Anger Effectiveness System training program, where each of it's going to be 6 90-minute modules, so a total of 9 hours. That includes a webinar for each module, accompanying worksheets, an audio and transcript of each webinar later when they're done, and a private Facebook conversation group for participants. This is not anger management training. That's all about symptom control, and you can get that in plenty of other places if what you want is anger management. This focuses on anger prevention, completion, and repair mastery. It is also not a course in assertiveness training. That you can get in plenty of other places too. That's about learning new behaviors without the accompanying inner shifts. This is going to focus on stepping into your authentic, effective, collaborative personal power at home, at work, and in community. In other words, full spectrum anger effectiveness system. This system provides you with key foundational life skills for authentic, empowered, collaborative integrity. And I'm going to be going over 5 simple systems in one. Helpful anger expression system is boundaries intelligence, escalation U-turns and flooding recovery systems, looping freedom system, anger completion system, an effective apologies system for repair and new plan, and the bonus webinar, the 6th of the webinars, will be a troubleshooting mastermind webinar. And let me think about this for all of that and 9 hours of the webinars. I'm not even going to go over how I've been scolded about this pricing. Even the pricing, that's the real pricing, $147 for this, I've been scolded as being too low, but I just want this out. So the cost for this is $97 if you do an early enrollment by June 23rd. I'm going to give you the link to it in a moment. By the way, 100% of you say that having full spectrum anger effectiveness would be highly useful. So I'm going to end that poll, and what I want to do is to switch over to this, because there we go. So it should be displaying right now. Lillian, who's on the call or was on the call, you may still be on the call, said something like this in Facebook the other day: "Never in a million years did I imagine that anger effectiveness had anything to do with living whole and a life of integrity. Our team is buzzing about it. I'm eager for more." If you're eager for more too, you can click on the button that has appeared in your webinar page that says, "Yes, I want in," and you can get the $97 rate if you do that now or until June 23rd. That's your early responder discount. And if you need a link outside of this, outside of this webinar, it's drgruder.com, anger effectiveness. drgruder.com, drgruder.com/anger effectiveness. So here's what I want to close the pre-question and answer portion of this with, is this to leave you with before we get into Q&A. Indulging anger is never justified. Ignoring anger is asking for trouble. There is a third alternative: anger literacy and effectiveness. So with that said, oh, there's my Q&A. Maybe my Q&A disappeared. Oh, that's what this symbol is for, questions. All right, I'm just going to leave this screen up while we do question and answer. I'll leave it up for a little while, and then I'm going to switch it back over to me so you can see me. In fact, I think you have been. Let's see. Are you looking at me now? No, you're not. You're looking. No, you are. You haven't even seen the screen for a while, have you? I never went back. I know what it was. After my story, I never went back to this. So you want in, but you're in a coffee shop without your credit card. No problem. No problem. You can do it at home. Not a problem at all. Yes, this will be a great boon for your EFT practice. And Kenneth, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize until now that you were missing the slides. Catherine, you said it too. Switch back to the presentation. The screen is on you. I missed it. I'm so sorry. But again, you can watch the video, and you'll see the slides when you rewatch the video. My apologies on that. I got really wrapped up in the story, and that's why I totally forgot to put the screen share back on. So what I'm opening up right now is the questions that I received prior to this webinar. Here they are. Will there be a replay option? Yes, you're going to get the link to it. So be looking in your email for that. My co-parent, a queen of anger, admits to using anger to get her way. She's modeling this to our child and has been violent with both my child and me. What should I do? Well, again, this is just an educational webinar, so I'm not in a position to give you therapeutic advice, but how to handle abuse situations, again, is beyond what this webinar can address. But remember, training like what I've covered in this webinar and in my full spectrum anger effectiveness course, even though it's not psychotherapy or counseling, it's only education, it may very well be that asking her to watch the recording of this webinar may open up her teachability. And that if she does open up her teachability after viewing the recording of this webinar, then you and she might benefit from enrolling in the full spectrum anger effectiveness course. If she's unwilling to do that or is unable to change her ways on her own, with or without this course, then it would be, the next step really is to seek counseling, in my opinion. If she is unwilling to participate in the counseling, get into counseling yourself and be prepared for the possibility that she might leave if you have no alternative but to but be prepared for the possibility that she might leave you no alternative, forgive me for that wording, but that she might leave you no alternative but to file a child abuse report after you've first done your prudent pre-planning and risk mitigation, which you should do with a trained professional. Some clients in my EFT practice have anger rooted. Yeah, will I email the link? Yeah, I can email the link. That's not a problem at all. Before I get into the next question that was pre-sent to me, what boundaries did you discover that your father had? My father's boundaries were that he just wanted to be loved and accepted as he was, even though he did self-destructive things, like was a chain smoker his whole life, even though he died from advanced COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It didn't feel like love to him to be called on the carpet for being self-destructive. And the reason I learned that that didn't feel like love to him was that his cigarette smoking was part of what he did to manage his pain. It was a soothing device for him, and he was willing to live fewer years in order to control the chronic pain he had from a very devastating physiological condition, a genetic one called ankylosing spondylitis, which is a progressive, deteriorating rheumatoid arthritis of the spinal cord that leads to spinal fusion, a limited range of motion, and chronic pain. That's so those are some of the boundaries I discovered that my dad had. And once I was free of looping anger toward him, I was able to love him in ways that felt like love to him, which meant that it was up to me to make peace with him probably dying younger than I would have wanted him to, which he did at age 69. But that was his choice. That wasn't my choice to make for him. Good. So some clients in my EFT practice, emotional freedom techniques and energy psychology method, it's the most well-known of the energy psychology or tapping techniques, have anger rooted in early childhood traumas, and sometimes so early that they can't remember specifics. How can I handle this? Well, what I recommend when I'm actually mentoring therapists is I recommend that the therapist help clients in this situation identify the earliest person or people they wanted something from that they're still carrying a grievance over not having gotten, or one since childhood, since earlier times, who they carry an even bigger grievance toward, an even larger grievance toward, because the themes with those people that they can remember having those grievances toward are often the doorway into the pre-memory incidents. So I don't even worry about initially going all the way back to the earliest one, or the one that seems to be hidden, that they don't remember. The other thing is educate them about the dynamics of looping anger, of anger purgatory, like I described in this webinar, and help them choose to get free of being a prisoner to that. That's the general answer. we'll go into much more detail about working with looping anger in the full spectrum anger effectiveness course. And I'm not harping on that to try to manipulate you into enrolling in that course if it's not a right fit for you. I'm really saying this because I can only cover so much in a webinar this length, and I really need more time to do a deeper dive to answer those kinds of questions in a fuller way. And I'm sure that those of you who are listening to this can appreciate that. What I'm going to do right now as I continue to answer questions, as I'm going to switch back to me being on the screen so you can see me. And I'm going to continue answering questions from here. In fact, let me switch my screens so that I can read this and be looking into the camera at the same time. How do you deal with people who shovel anger under the rug? Well, the first thing you do is you access compassion about their not knowing what true, authentic, pure anger is, and engage them in conversation about their boundaries and the bridges between your boundaries and theirs. If you've got mastery with collaborative boundaries and they're still not responsive to you doing that or attempting that with them, then you're probably dealing with someone who's in looping anger, in that most difficult form of anger to, unhelpful anger to deal with, and who has an indirect expression style on top of that. So unless you've got mastery with your own looping anger and training and facilitating others with theirs, perhaps the best thing you can do in a situation like this, as well as like before what I said, is to invite them to view the replay of this webinar, and we will go into more detail in the full course on this. What do I do with a friend who instantly attacks me instead of my requests? Before I answer that, let me go back to your questions. Yes, so I will email the link. Yeah, I will email you the link. I'm an NLP and timeline therapy coach. This will not help me a lot, thank you. Yeah, it's not going to be a substitute for NLP. But if your clients do not understand these basics about anger, my experience is that NLP, timeline therapy, and all other forms of therapy have only limited value in resolving in resolving looping anger. You can do some of that with timeline therapy, but what you can't really do is give people anger literacy through doing NLP. Anger literacy is a life skill, it's a skill set, and skill sets are not psychotherapy, no matter what therapeutic method we're talking about. David, will the last 3 slides from today's webinar be included in the replay? Absolutely they will. Absolutely they will. But yes, I'll try to remember before I wrap up Q&A to re-show. Oh, yeah, you know what? That's a good point. No, here's what I'm going to do, because they won't be showing in the replay. I'm going to re-show those slides after I finish up with question and answer right now. So that's a really good, I'm really glad you brought that up. And thank you, Helen. You just registered, very excited to get this training. Will I be offering certification so that you go out and share the information with the public? I am going to be offering a certification program. We should talk about that offline though, because there's more that I would need to train people in than I can do in 9 hours of training. There's just more that I would have to do in order to be able to provide certification, but that can be done. What do I do with a friend who instantly attacks me instead of listening to my requests? Find compassion for their escalation, flooding, or looping. Ask them if they're willing to join you to find a better way. If they are, watch the replay of this webinar with them and ask them if they're willing to join with you based on what they learn in this webinar in creating a new plan together for handling these kinds of conversations together in a better way. And of course, we'll go into detail about handling escalation, flooding, and looping anger in the full course. And you'll also learn a format for doing damage repair and making new plans for handling future similar situations. Anger about personal injustice, betrayal by authority, that's of course about looping, and you already heard about the dynamics of looping, and of course we'll go into greater detail about that in the course as well. Anger and parenting. How to deal, here's a book that I would recommend if you're dealing with anger and parenting. I hope it's still available. It came out decades ago. It's an absolute classic for dealing with these kinds of issues with teenagers. It's called How to Deal with Your Acting Up Teenager. And the authors are Bayard and Bayard, B-A-Y-A-R-D and B-A-Y-A-R-D. Let's see, I think I lost my place. Bayard and Bayard, parenting. There we are. Right. And of course, we'll go into how to develop healthy boundaries as well in the course. Living with an angry person who expresses it hurtfully and doesn't apologize easily, they don't realize that this is triggered by past unresolved relationships more than by what's occurring in the present moment. Of course not. What percentage of the population does? So have them listen to the webinar. And of course, we'll go into more detail about handling looping anger in the course. How do you reverse anger feelings? Well, we've covered that during this webinar about how to do this with each of the unhelpful forms of anger, as well as covering the importance of upgrading your boundaries intelligence. And of course, we'll go into greater detail in the course. How do you diffuse others when they're angry? If they're escalating, ask them what they're not, I'm sorry, let me say that the correct way. If they're escalating, ask them what they're most willing, most wanting to have come from the discussion. Ask them what they are most wanting to have come from this discussion, because that usually will shift people into teachability. Then ask them what they're wanting from that, and just keep going down that rabbit hole until you get to bedrock about what they're really wanting underneath their posturing and positioning and ultimatuming and escalating and judgment and all of that. This is part of boundaries intelligence and escalation intelligence. And if they're not responsive to you doing that, they might simply need to be kept company for a little while as they bleed off some excess energy through unhurtful venting before they are open to being invited to discover their authentic boundaries. If they're flooded, it's of course time for a timeout. It's timeout time to be followed by a boundaries exploration. And if they're looping, you might only be able to be a compassionate, non-judgmental ear until you become proficient enough in dealing with looping anger so that you can assist them in getting free of that if they're open to that. How do you identify your triggers? Well, you can discover your triggers by watching what activates escalation in you, by noticing your critics' editorials when you're escalating, and by noticing what flips you over into fight, flight, freeze, or faint responses in flooding anger. How do you identify the core wound or issue behind the trigger? By recognizing the theme you're looping around. What theme is it that you're doing the looping around? And asking yourself, like the theme I was looping around with Dad was, if only he wouldn't rage, then we could have a happy family. Well, not likely to happen, although this was a miracle story, so this broke the mold, and it did happen in this situation. But again, I have to reemphasize, that would never have even been an option for happening until I first got fully free of my looping anger with my dad. So how do you identify the core wound or issue behind a trigger? By recognizing the theme you're looping around and asking yourself who you first recall this theme surfacing with, and or who this theme was the most dramatic with, if it wasn't the first person or the first person you can recall. And of course, we'll go into much more detail about that during the course too. How do you respond without defensiveness when someone blames you or accuses you of inappropriate behavior? By remembering what you learned today. By remembering that they don't have anger literacy, they don't have anger intelligence. They don't know boundaries, from looping, from escalating, from flooding. They don't know any of this stuff. So by building the muscles that no one taught you before now around recognizing that when someone is doing this, they're by definition escalating, flooded, or looping. And by remembering that if you're hooked, it's because there's a grain of truth in what they're saying that's hooking you into believing that the entire package of what they're saying must be true. We only get hooked when there's a grain of truth in what someone's saying to us. But then we end up buying the entire package, hook, line, and sinker, and that sends us off to the races, either internally in terms of shame or externally in terms of attack. That's about your own inner critic perpetrating what I call inner child abuse on you. And we'll go into detail about this in the course too. How do you remain compassionate toward yourself and others while healing the wounds that activate anger? Before I answer that, what's a good time to contact you offline? Just email me, and Dr. David at thenewiq.com, DRDAVID at THENEW, the letter I, the letter Q.com, and we'll set something up. Perhaps you could just enclose the Anchor Mountain slide with a replay as a PDF. Well, that's a great suggestion, Catherine. I think I may do that. I think I may do that. Right, okay. So how do you remain compassionate toward yourself and others while healing the wounds that activate anger? Always keep in mind that not even most therapists know about anger, what all of you now are starting to know. Most therapists don't even know this. So, and I don't say that to blame them. They haven't been exposed. Like I said, the folks at the University of Arizona in their psych department, they were brilliant clinicians, academicians, and researchers. They weren't entrepreneurs. It's not the therapist's fault that they haven't heard of this stuff. In addition to keeping in mind that most therapists don't even know what you're starting to know, to go more in detail, always keep in mind that escalating anger is contaminated by inner critic judgments. It's not pure, authentic, helpful anger. And the more you upgrade your anger literacy, intelligence, and effectiveness, the more compassion you'll find toward both yourself and others when working on the underlying wounds. And the better you'll get at recognizing and completing looping anger, the better you'll get at healing the wounds that trigger your anger in the first place. We'll go into that more in the class as well. What do you do when you have difficulty connecting with self-directed anger in real time? Well, you forgive yourself for never having been provided anger literacy, intelligence, and effectiveness training before now. And you discover how learning to direct anger toward yourself in unhealthy ways was a life-saving tactic at the time you first invented it. And thank that earlier you for having been such an intuitive genius in figuring out this survival tactic. Practice noticing your sensations and other symptoms that are going on when you're directing anger toward yourself. And when you notice these, practice asking yourself about the boundary you've got that you didn't know you have, or had hoped you could get away with not honoring, or haven't developed the boundaries literacy in order to be able to honor it effectively and compassionately, either collaboratively with the other person or without their cooperation if need be. We'll go into that in the boundaries module of the course. How can I keep life's disappointments, both personally and professionally, from angering me? Well, become masterful at harvesting gifts. There's no such thing as an unacceptable life experience that doesn't have an undesired gift for you in its hands. And I may tell another very powerful story about that during the course. Practice forgiving yourself for roads not taken. Get the upper hand on your inner critic. And most of all, get good at recognizing that when you're angry, it's because you have a boundary you didn't know you have, or hoped you could get away with, or haven't developed the boundaries literacy to honor it effectively or compassionately, either collaboratively or with the other person or without their cooperation if need be. In other words, same as the prior question. Same as the prior question. I'm so glad this is like life-changing stuff. I totally understand your need to get off the phone, to get off the webinar. And again, remember, you can watch the rest of this and listen to the rest of this when you tune into the replay. Is this applicable with borderline personality and DBT, which is short for dialectical behavior therapy, another therapeutic approach? Yes, though, as you now know, this webinar hasn't been about how to do therapy. But that said, teachability is the key to all change, no matter what the diagnosis or lack thereof, and no matter what the therapeutic method is that's being used. My experience is that those who are teachable tend to be extremely grateful for this kind of framework that I've been going over with you today, and that because of it, they become much more devoted than ever to becoming masterful in how they deal with all 4 shades of anger, as well as with damage repair. Why am I afraid of anger? Well, I think that's pretty clear now that you've been through this webinar. Now, of course, I have no way of knowing why the person who was asking that question is afraid of anger in particular. But I learned very young, prior to starting in school, in fact, personally, to be very afraid of my own anger. Again, either in 1st or 2nd grade, I think it was before school, when I scared myself because I gave a kid who was bullying me a gusher of a bloody nose. And I made a vow to myself that I was never going to let that happen again. I've generally found that people tend to be afraid of their anger, like I became, because they don't have the benefit of the sorts of anger intelligence, literacy, and effectiveness that I've really tried to illuminate during this webinar. How can I learn the difference between helpful and harmful anger? Well, that's what this webinar has really been about, of course. Help my emotional responses work more closely with my intellectual understanding? Well, my hope is that the full spectrum anger webinar system that I've introduced to you today has given you a framework for aligning your emotional responses with your intellectual understanding and realigning those two when you get flooded and have recovered from flooding. By the way, thank you to those of you who are, and there are quite a few of you who are still tuning in and listening to the Q&A. I'm into the home stretch now with Q&A, and then I'll go through the remaining slides that I forgot to show on the screen. Rage response, reasonable response to stimulus. Example, a plastic cup containing water falls to the floor and spills the water, and rage is the reaction. Well, this always results from not doing escalation U-turns, from an inner critic takeover, and or from looping anger. So you now have a framework for dealing with those shades of anger in a different kind of way, and of course we'll go into greater depth during the course. Redirecting anger into productivity, that's what boundaries intelligence is all about. We'll go into this in greater depth as well. How do you redirect anger into productivity? That's all about boundaries intelligence, like I said. Feelings of hurt turned into pain. Well, this is what inevitably happens because so few of us learn to develop right relationship with the only helpful form of anger that exists that never gets called anger, boundaries, or at least the no and ouch aspect of boundaries. And so you've got a framework now for getting free of your hurt and restoring your authenticity. Biological causes of anger, such as heavy metal toxicity. My husband projected a lot of anger at me, ex-husband actually, projected a lot of anger at me, which he denied. After our divorce, he discovered he had high levels of mercury and lead toxicity. He's been doing chelating therapy since then, and says he feels a lot less angry. Well, you know, think of anger. Here's back to my dad's example, which is why I used that in this webinar. Dad didn't suddenly stop being angry after we had this massive healing. He stopped raging, but his physiological chronic pain still caused him to be chronically irritable. So think of the difference between the physiology and the psychology. It's kind of like, and forgive me for this analogy, but I think you'll understand where I'm going with this. It's kind of like PMS, where biochemical, being out of whack temporarily biochemically, leads to a heightened state of irritability or depression or whatever it may lead to. But when this translates into anger, the irritability is simply magnifying emotions that were already there. And that's what I was explaining with my dad, that my dad had irritability, yes. And he had unresolved childhood abuse issues, yes. But the physiological part of it was aggravating the childhood abuse issues. It hadn't caused the childhood abuse issues. It's both and, not either or. Same thing with marijuana and anger. This person says, I've noticed a lot of angry people like to smoke pot regularly. They're much less angry when high, even if they're not stoned. But when they come down, they get easily annoyed or angry. As our society legalizes marijuana more and more, which I think is a good thing, this person is saying we need more education about the problems with regular consumption. And again, biochemical imbalances like a depression or irritability when coming down off of pot or other drugs, caffeine or nicotine, can definitely lead to heightened irritability. But when this translates into anger, the irritability is simply magnifying emotions that were already there, like I was saying before. And in an angry society like ours, anger literacy is a must, regardless of marijuana consumption. How to shift a trigger into positive action? Well, escalation U-turns, anger completion, and repair a new plan. Last one was how to deal with scary bosses and sullen, angry, distant coworkers. Well, I have four specific recommendations there. First is get good at not being toxified by or judgmental about their anger or literacy. We're all in this boat together. We're all bozos on the anger bus. The second is give them venting room to give them a chance to do an escalation U-turn and recover from flooding before attempting to move into problem solving. Premature problem solving is a very foolhardy thing to attempt. When people's brains are offline, when their limbic system is running them and their cortex is turned off, that is never the time to try to do problem solving. The part of their brain they need in order to do that is offline. That doesn't mean don't do the problem solving ever. It means don't do it then. Wait until they're out of flooding. Third recommendation is get good at boundaries intelligence, including making new collaborative plans to handle future similar situations effectively. And fourth, in a work situation, if you see evidence of chronic looping anger, you may have no choice but to take it up with HR, with the HR department. And just remember that if you do that, you're going to want to have them access my full spectrum anger effectiveness system, simply because the anger management that they're going to be tempted to try to do doesn't work with looping anger. Those interventions aren't likely to be enough to help with that. So that's what I've got in the way of questions and answers. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to go back over to screen share and share. And I'm going to, let me make sure I'm going in the right direction. Oh, yeah, I was going in the right direction. Let me back up to where I forgot to put the slides back on. And I'm going to go through those steps. So this is where I forgot to put the slides back on after my story with Dad. Again, I apologize. I got so wrapped up in retelling that and re-experiencing that really sacred, holy moment of miracle that I forgot to re-engage the screen share. So unexpected bonus, Dad, bonus. Don't ever count on this, because it doesn't usually happen, but sometimes it does. That ended his rageaholism. So poll number 6, you already filled out, so I'm not going to spend time on that slide. Your next step, the reminder about this webinar only being educational, it's not therapy, it's not counseling, and that you, by attending it, as I said at the very beginning, you agreed that how you understand and utilize what you've learned is solely in your hands. This was the anger mountain slide that I showed earlier on in this webinar, and so I'm just renewing it here to show you that we went through all of these briefly: boundaries, escalation, flooding, anger purgatory or looping anger, completion, repair, and a new plan. This is a review of the original slides, worded slightly differently, but full spectrum anger effectiveness is your ability to recognize and embody helpful, empowered anger, which is boundaries, and your ability to recognize and take responsibility when you're in distorted, disempowered, harmful anger, otherwise known as escalation, flooding, and anger purgatory or looping, recycling anger, and bring yourself back to authentic, empowered anger with attendant repair and new plan as necessary. The reason each shade of anger requires different effectiveness skills is because boundaries intelligence is its own skill. It's all about anger prevention, not anger management. Escalation calls for U-turns back to boundaries. That's where things like anger management and DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, can work, but not unless. But the only way that they really work is by redirecting the person back to discovering what their boundaries were and how to honor those in good ways. Flooding makes escalation U-turns temporarily impossible because the thinking part of the brain is flooded with stress chemicals and has been turned off temporarily, so it requires a timeout instead. And I'm going to talk about timeout contracts during the course. And looping requires completing old unresolved anger that keeps being involuntarily reactivated in the present, so you stop being triggerable. So the 4 shades of anger effectiveness: boundaries is self-disclosure without justifying, and that calls for boundaries, intelligence, and effectiveness upgrades. Escalation is about escalation U-turn effectiveness upgrades. Flooding is about timeout effectiveness upgrades, and stuck recycling, looping anger is about anger completion and repair effectiveness upgrades. We did this poll as well. Those were really the only slides that you missed. These slides are just simply about the course itself, the modules, the worksheets, the private Facebook conversation group, that it's not anger management training. It's on anger prevention, completion, and repair mastery. It's not assertiveness training. It focuses on stepping into your authentic, effective, collaborative personal power at home, at work, and in community. It's really about providing you with key foundational life skills for authentic, empowered, collaborative integrity. And these are the systems that we're covering in the course. Helpful